Between the margins of ancient books, a forbidden spark ignites. Not all wars are fought with wands. The most dangerous battle is the one where your heart chooses the wrong side. The story is being written in this very moment. The library at midnight was a cathedral of shadows, illuminated only by the fitful flicker of a dying candle and the silver spill of a gibbous moon through the high arched windows. Hermione Granger sat at her accustomed desk, hidden behind a fortress of towering tomes. The air here was thick with the scent of ancient glue, the dry tooth of parchment, and a faint metallic tang, the ozone of a nearby hex. She wasn't alone. She didn't need to look up to know that 3 tables away, Draco Malfoy was staring at the same page of theories of alchemical transmutation for the last 20 minutes. The silence between them was not hollow. It was a pressurized chamber, a magnetic pull that vibrated in the soles of her feet. Hermione shifted, the rough wool of her jumper dragging against the grain of the oak table. She reached for her quill, her fingers trembling just enough to make the nib scratch a jagged line across her parchment. Since the beginning of term, their interactions had devolved, or perhaps evolved, into this. A series of wordless challenges, a game played in the margins of library slips, and the lingering heat of a chair left warm. She felt his gaze move. It wasn't a look, it was a weight. It settled on the nape of her neck, right where a stray curl had escaped her clip. Draco didn't speak. He never did. But the way he exhaled, a slow, deliberate release of air that sounded like a surrender, cut through the stillness more sharply than a shout. Hermione reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was her private refuge, filled with calculations that had nothing to do with arithmancy and everything to do with the shifting architecture of her own heart. She felt his movement then, the soft, rhythmic click of a silver ring against the wood of his table as he tapped out a restless cadence. She began to write, her script frantic and tight. "The silence is louder than the war," she scrawled. "Every time he breathes, the air in this room feels like it's being siphoned out. Why does he look at me like I'm a riddle he's already solved, but is too afraid to read aloud?" She felt a sudden, sharp draft. Draco had stood up. She watched from the corner of her eye as he moved toward the restricted section, his movements fluid and predatory, yet burdened by a subtle stiffness in his shoulders. He stopped behind her chair. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was visceral. The heat radiating from him was a physical interference, a jarring impact on her senses that made the ink on her quill dry mid-stroke. He reached over her shoulder, not to grab her, but to reach a book on the shelf above her head. His sleeve, fine black wool brushed against her ear. The scent of sandalwood and something cold, like mountain air, enveloped her. "You're pressing too hard, Granger," he whispered. His voice was a low rasp, a tactile friction that sent a shiver down her spine. "You'll tear the parchment." Hermione's knuckles whitened as she gripped the notebook. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. If she did, the static between them might finally spark into a flame she couldn't extinguish. "And you're lurking, Malfoy. It's unbecoming." "I'm observing," he corrected. He leaned closer, his chest inches from her back. She could hear the frantic rhythm of her own heart echoing in the hollow space between them. "I'm wondering when the brightest witch of her age will realize that some answers aren't found in books." He withdrew as quickly as he had approached, leaving a vacuum of cold air in his wake. Hermione exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't see the shadow in the doorway. Harry stood there, his face partially obscured by the darkness of the corridor. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had watched the exchange, the lean of Draco's body, the way Hermione had tilted her head toward the sound of the Slytherin's voice, the heavy, unspoken intimacy that hung in the air like smoke. To Harry, it didn't look like an intellectual duel. It looked like a betrayal. As Draco disappeared into the depths of the stacks, Hermione stayed frozen, her eyes fixed on the notebook. She began to write again, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of defiance and longing. She didn't notice when she finally packed up, leaving the library with her head down, her mind 1,000 miles away from the golden trio. She didn't notice that in her haste, she had left a loose leaf of parchment tucked into the back of her notebook, half protruding. The next morning, the great hall was a cacophony of clashing cutlery and boisterous laughter. But for Hermione, it felt like a distant dream. She sat next to Ron, who was mid-sentence about Quidditch tactics, but her eyes were drawn to the Slytherin table. Draco was there, looking pale and composed, picking at a piece of dry toast. He looked up, and for a fleeting second their eyes locked. It was a visceral alignment, a moment where the rest of the world blurred into insignificance. Hermione. The voice was sharp, cutting through her reverie. She turned to find Harry staring at her, his expression unreadable. He held a piece of parchment in his hand, the very one she had been writing on the night before. "I found this," Harry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "In the common room. It fell out of your bag." Hermione's stomach dropped. She reached for it, her movements frantic as she tried to straighten her sleeve cuffs, a nervous habit she couldn't suppress. "Harry, that's private. Give it back." "Private?" Harry's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You're writing about him, Hermione, about Malfoy. The air being siphoned out. A riddle he's afraid to read. What is this?" "It's nothing," she hissed, her face flushing a deep crimson. "It's just thoughts, observations. You had no right to read it." "I have every right when my best friend is losing her mind over a Death Eater," Harry countered, his voice rising just enough to draw curious glances from nearby students. "He's dangerous, Hermione. He's the enemy. Have you forgotten everything he's done? Everything his family stands for?" "I haven't forgotten anything." Hermione snapped, her voice trembling with a cocktail of embarrassment and fury. "But I'm not a child, Harry. You don't get to dictate who I think about or what I write in my own journals. You don't own me." "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need your protection. I need your trust." The tension between them was a physical wall, thick and suffocating. Ron looked between them, his mouth hanging open, a piece of bacon forgotten on his fork. Across the room, Draco Malfoy watched the scene with a mask of cool indifference, but the way his fingers curled around the handle of his goblet suggested otherwise. He saw the way Hermione's eyes brimmed with tears of frustration, the way she stood up so abruptly, her chair screeched against the stone floor. "If you're so worried about my safety, Harry," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a cold, precise edge that was far more terrifying than a scream, "perhaps you should worry about your own lack of boundaries." because right now, the only person making me feel unsafe is you." She turned and marched out of the great hall, her robes billowing behind her. She didn't head for the Gryffindor Tower. She headed for the one place she knew she could find a different kind of conflict, one that didn't involve being treated like a fragile doll. She found him in the Transfiguration courtyard, leaning against a stone pillar, watching the rain begin to fall in thin, grey sheets. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Draco didn't look surprised to see her. He straightened up, the silver of his prefect badge catching the dull light. "Trouble in paradise, Granger." Hermione walked right up to him, stopping so close she could see the faint grey circles under his eyes, the evidence of his own sleepless nights. The anger at Harry was still a hot coal in her chest, and she used it to fuel a sudden, reckless bravery. "He read my notes," she said, her voice shaking. "He thinks he can tell me what to do. He thinks he knows what's best for me." Draco's eyes narrowed, a flash of something dark and protective flickering in their depths. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his cloak. "And what do you think, Hermione?" It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken in his velvet drawl, was a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. "I think," she whispered, stepping into his space until the bite of his silver ring against her hand was the only thing she could feel, "that I'm tired of being told who I'm supposed to be." She looked back toward the great hall, where she knew Harry was likely still standing, fuming and confused. Then, with a deliberate, defiant motion, she turned back to Draco and leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a gesture of war as much as it was a gesture of seeking comfort. The static between them intensified, a tremor of pure, unadulterated tension that promised a storm far greater than the one gathering in the sky above. Draco didn't move at first, his body a statue of frozen conflict. Then, slowly, he tilted his head until his temple rested against hers. A silent, dangerous pact formed in the grey light of the morning. "Fine," he murmured, the word vibrating against her skin. "Let them watch." The aftermath of the courtyard confrontation lingered in the air like the thick, metallic scent of a brewing storm. For Hermione, the world had shifted on its axis. The familiar comforts of the Gryffindor common room, the crackling fire, the overstuffed armchairs, the easy camaraderie, now felt like a set of velvet shackles. Every time Harry looked at her, she saw the silent accusation in his eyes, a paternalistic shadow that made her skin crawl with the need to escape. She spent the following days in a state of hyper-awareness. Her internal monologue was no longer a structured list of revision schedules. It was a chaotic map of Draco Malfoy's movements. She tracked the silver flash of his hair in the corridors, the specific rhythmic tempo of his footsteps echoing against the stone, and the way the air seemed to thin whenever he entered a room. The tension between her and Harry had reached a point of frigid stasis. They spoke in monosyllables, a brittle exchange of necessities that lacked any of their former warmth. Harry's protective instinct had curdled into a brooding surveillance. He was always there, a silent sentinel in the periphery of her vision, his presence a constant reminder of the boundaries he expected her to maintain. It was Tuesday evening when the atmospheric pressure finally shifted. Hermione was in the charms classroom, staying late to practice the intricate wand movements of the Avis charm. The room was bathed in the amber glow of sunset, the dust motes dancing in the slanted light like microscopic gold. The door creaked open. She didn't need to turn around. The sudden drop in the room's temperature, the faint scent of winter air and expensive parchment, told her exactly who had entered. Draco didn't go to his usual desk. He walked toward the window, his silhouette sharp against the burning orange sky. He looked weary, the lines of his face drawn tight, as if he were holding a crumbling structure together by sheer force of will. He didn't speak for a long time, the only sound being the soft scratching of Hermione's quill as she forced herself to continue her notes. "He's following you, you know," Draco said finally. His voice was a low rasp, a tactile friction that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Hermione's hand slipped, a blot of ink blooming like a dark flower on her parchment. She straightened her sleeve cuffs, a frantic, repetitive motion that betrayed the tremor in her fingers. "I'm aware." "He thinks he's a hero," Draco continued, turning to face her. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the hollow of his throat. "But he's just a jailer with a better reputation." Hermione looked up then, her brown eyes meeting his grey ones. The intensity of the gaze was a visceral alignment, a moment where the pretense of their mutual loathing felt like a thin, transparent veil. "And what are you, Draco? A liberator?" A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. He moved toward her, his footsteps silent on the stone. He stopped at the edge of her desk, leaning down until they were at eye level. The proximity was an interference, a jarring impact on her nervous system. She could see the minute flecks of silver in his irises, the way his pulse throbbed at the base of his neck. "I'm the one who doesn't expect you to be perfect," he whispered. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from the back of her hand. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a magnetic pull, a static charge that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The restraint in his movement spoke of a deeper, more agonizing conflict than any words could convey. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that the fall would be beautiful and fatal. Hermione felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her, a sudden, sharp realization of how much she wanted him to bridge that tiny gap. She wanted the bite of his silver ring against her skin. She wanted to know if his touch was as cold as his reputation or as hot as his gaze. "You're dangerous," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm honest," he corrected. "There's a difference." The moment was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor. Draco withdrew instantly, his expression smoothing into a mask of cold indifference just as Harry rounded the corner. Harry stopped dead, his eyes darting between Hermione's flushed face and Draco's relaxed, arrogant posture. The whitening of Harry's knuckles as he gripped the strap of his bag was a clear indicator of the fury boiling beneath his surface. "Hermione, we're going to dinner," Harry said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. Hermione felt the familiar spark of rebellion ignite in her chest. She looked at Draco, who was watching Harry with a look of supreme boredom, though the tension in his shoulders told a different story. "I'm not hungry, Harry," she said, her voice steady and cool. "I said, we're going," Harry repeated, stepping into the room. He He didn't look at Draco, treating him as if he were a piece of furniture, an insult that Draco acknowledged with a slight, mocking tilt of his head. "I'll decide when I'm hungry," Hermione snapped, her patience finally snapping. "Go without me." "I'm not leaving you here with him." "Then stay," Hermione challenged, "and watch me do my homework. Because that is all that is happening here, despite what your imagination is telling you." The air in the room was thick with unspoken accusations. Harry looked at her as if she were a stranger, a girl he no longer recognized. He turned his gaze to Draco, his wand hand twitching. "Stay away from her, Malfoy," Harry warned, his voice low and dangerous. Draco let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're talking to the wrong person, Potter. Maybe you should ask yourself why she's looking for company elsewhere." Harry took a step forward, but Hermione moved faster, placing herself between them. She didn't do it to protect Draco. She did it to claim her own agency. "Harry, leave. Now." The betrayal in Harry's eyes was a physical blow, but he didn't argue further. He turned on his heel and marched out, the heavy thud of his boots echoing down the hall like a funeral march. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of the choice Hermione had just made. She felt a sudden, sharp chill, the adrenaline fading to leave her hollow and exposed. She turned back to her desk, her movements mechanical as she began to pack her things. "That was quite the performance," Draco remarked, though the mockery was gone from his voice. He was watching her with a strange, searching expression. "It wasn't a performance," she said, her voice cracking. I can't breathe when he's like that. I feel like I'm being erased." Draco moved closer again, his presence a silent anchor in the storm of her emotions. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't know how. Instead, he reached down and picked up a heavy, leather-bound book she had dropped. As he handed it to her, his fingers brushed against hers. It wasn't a fleeting contact. It was a visceral, tactile friction that seemed to ground her and set her on fire at the same time. The bite of his silver ring was cold against her knuckle, a sharp contrast to the searing heat of his skin. Hermione didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her breath hitching in her throat. For a moment, the world outside the charm's classroom ceased to exist. There was no war, no Harry, no expectations. There was only the atmospheric pressure of two people drawn together by a force they didn't understand and couldn't control. "You're playing with fire, Granger," Draco murmured, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin of her wrist. "Maybe I want to get burned," she whispered back, the honesty of the statement terrifying her. Draco's eyes darkened, a flash of raw, unfiltered desire breaking through his composure. He leaned in, his lips inches from her ear, his breath a warm ghost against her skin. "Be careful what you wish for. I might just let you." He pulled back then, the cold returning as he stepped away. "I'll see you in the library, Hermione. Don't be late." He vanished into the shadows of the corridor before she could respond, leaving her standing in the darkening room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The next few days were a blur of cold shoulders and whispered rumors. The school was alive with gossip about the rift in the Golden Trio. Hermione ignored it all, focusing instead on the illicit thrill of her secret meetings with Draco. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat in the same aisle of the library, the silence between them a living, breathing thing. the warmth was always followed by a sudden, jarring cold. Draco would be attentive, almost tender in his own jagged way, only to retreat behind a wall of biting sarcasm the next morning. It was a rhythm of approach and repulsion that kept Hermione in a constant state of emotional vertigo. One evening, they were in the North Tower, watching the moon rise over the Forbidden Forest. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and damp stone filling the night. "Why are you doing this, Draco?" Hermione asked, her voice soft. "Why me?" He didn't look at her. He was staring at his own hands, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the stone railing. "Because you're the only thing in this castle that feels real, Granger. Everything else is just shadows and lies." He turned to her then, his expression a mask of restrained agony. "But don't mistake this for something it isn't. I'm still a Malfoy. I'm still the boy who watched his family fall apart. There's no light left in me for you to find." "I don't need you to be a light," Hermione said, stepping closer, her hand reaching for his. "I just need you to be here." He looked at her hand, as if it were a cursed object, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. For a second, she thought he would take it. She saw the longing in his eyes, the desperate need for connection. Then, the mask slid back into place. He pulled his hands away, stuffing them into his pockets. "You should go, Granger. Potter will be looking for you." "Draco, go," he snapped, the sudden harshness of his voice like a physical blow. "I'm tired of the games. Just go back to your heroes and leave me to my shadows." The rejection was so sudden, so visceral that it left Hermione breathless. She felt the sudden need to straighten her cuffs, her fingers trembling violently. She didn't say another word. She turned and fled down the spiral staircase, the sound of her own sobbing breaths lost in the hollow echo of the tower. She ran until she reached the Gryffindor common room, her mind a whirlwind of pain and confusion. She burst through the portrait hole, only to find Harry sitting by the fire, a piece of parchment in his lap. He looked up, his face grim. "Where were you?" "It doesn't matter," she gasped, trying to push past him. "It matters to me," Harry said, standing up. He held up the parchment. It was a map, one he had been working on to track movements in the castle. "I saw you, Hermione. I saw you with him, in the North Tower." "So what?" she shouted, the frustration of the night finally erupting. "Are you going to arrest me, Harry? Are you going to lock me in a cell for the crime of talking to someone you don't like?" "I'm going to do what I have to do to keep you safe," Harry said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Even if you hate me for it." He didn't explain what he meant, but the look in his eyes told her that the sanctuary she had sought in Draco had just become a much more dangerous place. The atmospheric pressure of the castle was reaching a breaking point, and Hermione knew that the next time the storm hit, there would be no shelter left. The air in the Gryffindor common room had become an abrasive substance. Every breath Hermione took, feeling like it was laced with fine glass. Harry's silent, watchful presence was a weight that never lifted, a psychic pressure that made the familiar tapestries and the roar of the fire feel like the trappings of an interrogation room. He didn't shout anymore. He simply observed, his eyes tracking her every movement with the clinical detachment of an aura in training. Hermione spent the following morning in a state of suspended animation. During ancient runes, she stared at the symbols on the board until they blurred into meaningless scratches, her mind replaying the sharp, jagged edge of Draco's voice in the North Tower. "Just go back to your heroes." The words were a brand, a cauterized wound that throbbed with every beat of her heart. She felt the repulsion as a physical ache, a hollowing out of her chest that left her cold even in the sunlight. She avoided the library. She avoided the great hall. But she could not avoid the magnetic pull that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of more rain. Hermione was walking toward the owlery, her fingers tracing the rough texture of a letter she had no intention of sending, when a hand shot out from a recessed alcove and gripped her wrist. The contact was an interference, a sudden, visceral alignment of two forces that had been orbiting one another in a state of chaotic decay. She was pulled into the shadows of a disused corridor, her back meeting the cold, damp stone of the wall with a dull thud. "Get off me," she hissed, though the lack of conviction in her voice was a betrayal. Draco stood over her, his face a landscape of shadows and sharp angles. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. The fine, pale skin beneath his eyes was translucent, revealing a network of faint blue veins. His grip on her wrist was iron, the bite of his silver ring pressing into her skin until it left a crescent moon of white. "You're making a scene, Granger," he murmured, his breath fanning across her lips, tasting of peppermint and the bitter dregs of coffee. "Walking around the castle with that look on your face. Potter is practically foaming at the mouth." "Why do you care?" she countered, her knuckles whitening as she bunched the fabric of his robes in her free hand. "You told me to go back to my heroes. I'm doing exactly what you wanted." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that made the stone behind her head seem to hum. "You're doing it to spite him. You're using me as a weapon against his mediocrity." "And if I am?" Hermione challenged, her voice trembling. "At least you're a weapon that understands how it feels to be handled. He treats me like a relic, Draco. Something to be polished and kept behind glass." The silence that followed was a pressurized chamber. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the aristocratic pureblood shattered. She saw the internal conflict, the raw, unvarnished hunger of a man who was starving for a touch that didn't come with a price tag of blood or loyalty. He leaned closer, the atmospheric pressure between them reaching a point where she could no longer distinguish his heartbeat from her own. "I am not your sanctuary," he whispered, his forehead leaning against her. "I am the thing they warned you about. I've always preferred the difficult truths over the comfortable lies," she breathed. He let out a jagged, broken sound, half laugh, half sob, and released her wrist, only to cup the side of her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a tactile friction that sent sparks of static electricity through her entire body. The warmth was returning, a slow, honeyed heat that made her knees feel weak. "He's watching the map, Hermione," Draco said, his tone shifting to something more urgent. "He's obsessed. He thinks he's saving you from a fate worse than death, but he's just suffocating the only part of you that's still alive." "I know," she whispered. "Tonight," Draco said, his eyes locking onto hers with a visceral intensity. The 6th floor corridor, behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy. There's a passage that leads to the lower levels. I've found a place where even his map can't find us." "The room of requirement?" "No," he said, a dark shadow crossing his face. "Somewhere older, somewhere the castle forgot." He pulled away then, the cold returning with the suddenness of a guttering candle. He didn't look back as he strode away, his black robes blending into the darkness of the corridor. Hermione stood there for a long time, her hand resting over the spot where his fingers had grazed her neck. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she tried to compose herself. Dinner was an exercise in theatrical endurance. She sat across from Harry and Ron, her face a mask of studious indifference. Harry was silent, his eyes darting toward the Slytherin table every few minutes. He didn't eat. He simply pushed a piece of potato around his plate with a grim, focused energy. "Hermione," Harry said, his voice cutting through the clatter of the hall. "I need you to stay in the tower tonight. I've heard rumors. There's been some movement in the dungeons. Slytherins being recruited for something." "Rumors, Harry? Or more of your observations?" she asked, her voice dripping with a sarcasm that made Ron wince. "I'm serious," Harry said, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his fork. "It's not safe. For you especially." "I am a grown woman, Harry. I am a war veteran. I am perfectly capable of judging what is safe and what is not." "Not when your judgment is clouded by whatever this is." Harry gestured vaguely toward the Slytherin table. "You're being reckless. You're being emotional." "Emotional?" Hermione stood up so quickly her water goblet toppled, the liquid spreading across the tablecloth like a spilled secret. "Because I refuse to be your foot soldier. Because I have a life that doesn't revolve around your suspicions. I'm going to the library, and if I see you following me, Harry, I swear to Merlin, I will hex you into next week." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't go to the library. The corridors were nearly empty, the castle settled into its nightly rhythm of creaking floorboards and whispering portraits. Hermione slipped behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, her wand lit with a faint blue light. The passage was narrow and smelled of damp earth and ancient magic. She descended a winding flight of stairs that seemed to go on forever, the temperature dropping with every step. Finally, the stairs opened into a vast, vaulted chamber. It was a secondary library, perhaps, or a forgotten study. Rows of shelves filled with crumbling scrolls stretched into the darkness, and in the center of the room, a single green lamp burned on a heavy stone desk. Draco was waiting for her. He was sitting on the edge of the desk, his long legs crossed at the ankles, reading a scroll that looked like it might disintegrate at the slightest touch. "You came," he said, not looking up. "I told you I would." She moved toward him, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The atmosphere here was different, less like a school and more like a tomb or a cathedral. It was quiet in a way that felt sacred. "Potter thinks you're in the library," Draco said, finally looking at her. The green light of the lamp cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older, more haunted. "I saw him patrolling the 4th floor on my way down." "He's losing his mind," Hermione said, leaning against a shelf. "And I'm losing mine. Every time I'm near him, I feel like I'm being measured against a version of myself that doesn't exist anymore." "The Golden Girl," Draco mocked, though there was no heat in it. The perfect sidekick. It must be exhausting to be someone's moral compass. It is, she admitted, her voice small. She walked closer until she was standing between his knees. The interference of their personal spaces was immediate, a tactile friction that made her skin hum. She reached out and touched the scroll he was holding, her fingers brushing against his. "What is this place?" "A retreat," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandfather used it when the politics of the manor became too much. It's shielded, unplottable." He set the scroll aside and reached out, his hands finding her waist. The touch was firm, possessive, and for the first time, Hermione didn't feel the need to pull away. She felt a sudden, sharp relief, a shedding of the armor she had worn for years. "He'll never find you here," Draco murmured, his thumbs tracing the curve of her hip bones through her robes. "I don't want to be found," she replied. She looked up at him, and the tension that had been building for weeks finally reached its breaking point. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt. There was only the visceral alignment of two broken people finding a strange sort of wholeness in the dark. Draco leaned in, his nose brushing against hers. "If we do this, Hermione, if we cross this line, there's no going back. He'll never forgive you. Your world will burn." "Let it burn," she said, her voice steady. "I'm tired of being the one who keeps the fire under control." He didn't wait for her to change her mind. He captured her lips with a sudden, desperate intensity. The kiss was a jarring impact, a collision of teeth and tongue, and months of suppressed longing. It tasted of salt and iron and the cold, dark magic of the room. Hermione wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. She felt the bite of his silver ring against the nape of her neck, the scratch of his jaw against her cheek. It was messy and raw and utterly perfect. But then the warmth was punctured by a sudden, sharp sound, the screech of stone against stone. Draco froze, his body going rigid. He pulled back, his eyes wide and clouded with a sudden, visceral fear. He looked toward the entrance of the chamber, his hand flying to his wand. "Someone's here," he hissed. "It's impossible," Hermione whispered, her heart plummeting. "You said it was unplottable." "It is," Draco said, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his wand. "Unless they didn't use a map." The heavy oak door at the far end of the chamber creaked open, and a figure stepped into the pool of green light. It wasn't Harry. It was Lucius Malfoy, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury, his cane clicking against the stone floor with a sound that signaled the end of their brief, beautiful sanctuary. "Draco," his father said, the name sounding like a death sentence. "I believe it's time we discuss the company you've been keeping." The betrayal in Draco's eyes as he looked from his father back to Hermione was a visceral blow. He stepped away from her, the distance between them suddenly feeling like an ocean. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold so profound it felt like the end of the world. "Father," Draco said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," Lucius said, his gaze turning to Hermione with a loathing so deep it was almost tangible. "The mudblood will be dealt with, and you will return home, immediately." The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted again, becoming heavy and suffocating. Hermione looked at Draco, silently begging him to say something, to do something. but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood there, a pale shadow in the green light, his mask firmly back in place. The sanctuary had become a trap, and as Lucius Malfoy raised his wand, Hermione realized that the war she thought she had left behind was only just beginning. The air in the forgotten chamber didn't just grow cold, it turned stagnant, as if the very oxygen had been sucked into the lungs of the man standing in the doorway. Lucius Malfoy did not move like a person. He moved like a glacier, slow, inevitable, and devastating. The green light of the lamp cast his shadow long and distorted across the floorboards, a dark stain that seemed to swallow the hem of Hermione's robes. Hermione's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, jagged sound in the sudden vacuum of the room. She felt a frantic, visceral need to move, to reach for her wand, to close the distance between herself and Draco, but her limbs felt like they had been transmuted into lead. Her fingers twitched, a reflexive, desperate attempt to straighten her sleeve cuffs, but the motion was paralyzed by the weight of Lucius's gaze. It was a gaze that didn't see a person, but an infestation. "Explain, Draco!" Lucius's voice was a silken thread, thin and sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't raise his voice, yet the words echoed against the vaulted ceiling with the force of a physical impact. What is there to explain about a Malfoy heir grovelling at the feet of a girl who possesses nothing but the dirt beneath her fingernails? Draco's transformation was instantaneous and agonizing to witness. The boy who had just held her with a desperate, raw hunger vanished. In his place stood a hollowed-out vessel of pure-blood tradition. He retreated a step, then another, until the magnetic pull that had bound them together snapped with the violence of a breaking cable. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his wand, but he didn't point it at his father. He pointed it at the floor, his shoulders hunching as if under the weight of an invisible yoke. "It was a diversion, Father," Draco murmured. The lie was a dry, brittle thing. It lacked the usual oily polish of his sarcasm, sounding instead like the rattling of bones in a cage. An intellectual exercise, nothing more. Hermione felt the words like a series of sharp, tactile frictions against her chest. Each syllable was a betrayal, a cold gust of wind that extinguished the heat of their shared kiss. She looked at him, her brown eyes searching for a flicker of the man who had whispered, "Let it burn," only minutes ago. But Draco was gone. There was only a pale, trembling ghost in his skin. "An exercise," Lucius repeated, his lip curling in a visceral display of disgust. He tapped his cane against the stone floor. Click, click. The sound was a rhythmic execution of her hope. "You have forgotten your place, Draco. You have forgotten the blood that runs through your veins. This contamination ends now." Lucius raised his wand. The motion was fluid, practiced, and lethal. "No." Hermione finally found her voice, the word tearing from her throat. She stepped in front of Draco, her own wand finally clearing her pocket. The atmospheric pressure in the room spiked, a surge of static electricity that made her curls dance and her skin hum with the threat of a magical discharge. Lucius didn't flinch. He looked at her with the same detached curiosity one might afford a particularly stubborn insect. "Move, girl, or I shall find great pleasure in removing you myself." "You won't touch him," Hermione said, her voice shaking but her stance firm. Behind her, she could hear Draco's breath, shallow, panicked, a jagged rhythm of a heart losing its fight. "Hermione, stop," Draco whispered. The sound of her name was no longer a caress. It was a plea for her to vanish, to stop making the reality of their situation so undeniable. Just go, please. I'm not leaving you, she snapped, not turning around. The standoff was a pressurized chamber, the three of them locked in a visceral alignment of hatred, fear, and shattered pride. But then, a new sound entered the fray. A heavy, rhythmic thudding from the passage behind the tapestry. The door to the chamber didn't just open, it was blasted off its hinges. Expelliarmus! The red jet of light was a searing streak through the green gloom. Lucius Malfoy deflected it with a bored flick of his wrist, his eyes narrowing as Harry Potter stepped into the light, followed closely by Ron Weasley. Harry was panting, his glasses askew, the Marauder's map clutched in one white-knuckled hand. His face was a mask of righteous fury, but when his eyes landed on Hermione, standing protectively in front of Draco, that fury turned into a look of such profound betrayal that it felt like a physical interference. "Hermione, get away from them," Harry commanded. His voice was thick with a paternalistic authority that grated against Hermione's nerves like a serrated blade. "Harry, you don't understand. I understand plenty," Harry shouted, his gaze shifting to Lucius. "I saw him on the map. I didn't know he was here, but I knew you were with Malfoy. Again." "The boy who lived," Lucius sneered, though there was a flicker of genuine calculation in his eyes now. He was outnumbered, even if he was the more experienced duelist. Coming to save his pet. How remarkably predictable. "Shut up," Ron growled, his wand leveled at Lucius's chest. "We're taking Hermione, and we're leaving." "I am not a parcel to be taken," Hermione screamed, her frustration finally boiling over. She looked at Harry, then at Lucius, and finally at Draco, who was still standing in the shadows, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "All of you! You treat me like a prize, or a problem, or a disgrace. None of you actually see me." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the scent of ozone and the damp rot of the cellar. Harry took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. "Hermione, look at where you are. Look at who you're with. Malfoy's father is a Death Eater. Draco is a person," she countered, the defense feeling like a desperate lie even as she spoke it. "And he's the only one who hasn't spent the last month trying to lock me in a tower for my own good." "Because he's locking you in a cellar instead," Harry retorted. The atmospheric tension reached a breaking point. Lucius Malfoy, sensing the fracture in the group, saw his opening. He didn't go for Harry or Ron. He went for the one thing that would ensure his son's obedience and remove the source of his shame. "Avada!" "No!" Draco screamed. He didn't think. For the first time in his life, the impulse of the heart overrode the calculated survival of the mind. He threw himself into his father, the jarring impact of their bodies sending them both crashing into the heavy stone desk. The green lamp shattered, plunging the room into a chaotic darkness, illuminated only by the frantic sparks of wands. "Run!" Draco yelled, his voice cracking. "Hermione, run!" Harry grabbed Hermione's waist, hauling her toward the exit. She fought him, her heels dragging against the stone, her eyes fixed on the tangle of black and silver robes on the floor. "Draco, no!" "Move, Hermione!" Ron grabbed her other arm, and together the two boys forced her out of the chamber and up the narrow stairs. Behind them, the sounds of a struggle continued, the muffled grunts of physical friction, the sharp cracks of spells hitting stone, and finally a heavy, echoing thud that sounded like the closing of a tomb. They didn't stop until they reached the 7th floor. Harry shoved her into an alcove, his face inches from hers. He was shaking, a fine tremor of adrenaline and anger. What were you thinking? You almost got killed by his father while he stood there and watched. Hermione leaned her head against the cold stone, her breath coming in jagged sobs. The repulsion she felt for herself, for the situation, and for Harry's suffocating protection was a tidal wave. He saved me, Harry. He tackled his own father to save me. He put you in that position in the first place, Harry countered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his wand. He's a Malfoy. He's the enemy. And if you ever go near him again, Hermione, I'll have to tell McGonagall, for your own safety. The threat was the final straw. The warmth she had felt for her friends, the years of shared history and loyalty, felt like it was being siphoned out of her. She looked at Harry, and for the first time, she saw a stranger, a well-meaning jailer. "If you do that, Harry," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, precise whisper that made him flinch, "you will lose me forever. Not to the Slytherins, not to the war, just gone. Do you understand?" She didn't wait for his answer. She pushed past him, her heart a heavy, aching stone in her chest. She spent the night in the common room, staring at the dying embers of the fire. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the bite of Draco's silver ring against her neck, the desperate, salt-tasted pressure of his lips. She felt the internal conflict like a physical weight, the loyalty she owed her past versus the undeniable magnetic pull of a future that seemed written in shadows. The next morning, Draco wasn't at the Slytherin table. He wasn't in potions. He wasn't in the library. Hermione's anxiety grew until it was a tactile presence, a static charge that made her fingers twitch and her vision blur. She found herself straightening her cuffs every few minutes, a frantic, repetitive motion that drew concerned looks from the other students. She was leaving the great hall after lunch when a small, folded piece of parchment was shoved into her hand by a passing first-year Slytherin. She ducked into a nearby corridor, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had been shaking. Locked in the cellar. Not the library one. The manor. "He's taking me back. Don't come for me, Granger. Save yourself." "You were right. The air is being siphoned out." The words were a visceral blow. The image of Draco, broken and restrained in the very place he feared most, was more than she could bear. The internal monologue of doubt and fear that had plagued her for weeks suddenly coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. She didn't care about the war. She didn't care about the rules. She didn't even care about Harry's disappointment. She walked toward the Gryffindor Tower, but she didn't go inside. She stopped at the edge of the grounds, looking out toward the gates of Hogwarts. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the approaching winter. She knew what she had to do. The slow burn of their relationship had reached its flashpoint. The approach had been long and painful, the repulsion had been visceral, but the final shift was here. She wasn't going to let him rot in that cellar. She was going to be the interference that broke the Malfoy legacy. As she stepped past the boundary of the school, the air around her seemed to shimmer with the intensity of her resolve. The cold was still there, But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was the storm now, and she was coming for him. The boundary of Hogwarts disappeared behind her with a sickening wrench of space and time. Hermione materialized at the edge of the Malfoy estate, the apparition leaving a metallic tang of ozone in the back of her throat. Before her, the manor loomed like a skeletal beast against the iron-grey sky. It was a monument to cold stone and ancient, stagnant magic, its high hedges casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her ankles. The atmosphere here was not just silent, it was dead. The wind did not whistle. It wheezed through the leafless trees. Her heart was a frantic drum, a rhythmic thudding that vibrated in her ears. She felt the internal conflict clawing at her, the logical part of her brain screaming that this was a suicide mission, that Harry would be horrified, that the Ministry would brand her a fugitive. But that voice was drowned out by the visceral memory of Draco's fingers against her skin and the jagged, broken plea in his note. She didn't approach the front gates. Instead, she moved toward the servants' entrance near the kitchens, her movements fluid and desperate. The bite of the winter air was a tactile friction against her cheeks, but she didn't shiver. She was too focused on the atmospheric pressure of the house's wards. They were heavy, oily, and thick with the scent of dark enchantments. She reached the side of the house, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her wand. With a precise, silent flick, she cast a localized muffliato. The stone was damp, the texture of the moss beneath her fingertips feeling like slick, decaying velvet. She found the iron grate leading to the lower levels, the cellar. Not the library retreat they had shared, but the true underbelly of the Malfoy legacy. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet stone, iron, and a lingering sulphurous rot that had nothing to do with organic decay and everything to do with the magic practiced within these walls. Hermione descended the stone steps, her boots making no sound, yet the hollow echo of her own breathing felt loud enough to wake the portraits upstairs. The cellar was a labyrinth of shadows. As she moved deeper, the temperature plummeted. This was a cold that didn't just touch the skin, it seeped into the bone, a psychic frost designed to break the will. She passed rows of wine casks that looked like coffins in the dim light, until she reached a heavy, silver-reinforced door at the end of the corridor. The door didn't have a handle. It had a seal, the Malfoy crest, etched in silver that seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic light. "Draco," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. A sound came from within. Not a word, but a sharp, jagged intake of breath. "Hermione!" The sound of her name was a visceral alignment, a hook that pulled her flush against the cold metal of the door. Draco's voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual aristocratic polish. It sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. I told you not to come," he rasped, the words vibrating through the silver seal and into her palms. "I don't listen to you when you're being an idiot," she replied, her voice trembling. She pressed her forehead against the door, her fingers frantically tracing the edges of the seal, looking for a weakness. "Are you hurt? Did Lucius?" "He did what he always does," Draco said, a bitter, melodic laugh echoing in the small space. "He reminded me of the weight of my name. He reminded me that I am a possession, not a person." "You aren't a possession to me," she said, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her wand. Get back from the door, Draco. I'm going to break the seal. You can't. It's blood-bound, Hermione. If you force it, the wards will alert the entire house. My mother, the Dark Lord's sycophants. They're all here. You'll be dead before you reach the stairs. Then let them come, she snapped, the defiance in her voice a hot coal in the freezing dark. I am not leaving you in this hole. Why? The question was a jarring impact, a moment of raw, unfiltered vulnerability. After I pushed you away? After I let my father threaten you? Why are you here? Because you tackled him, she whispered, her heart hammering against the silver-clad wood. Because you chose me for 5 seconds, and that was enough to show me who you really are. And because I can't breathe in a world where Harry Potter decides my safety and you rot in a cellar. The silence that followed was a pressurized chamber, the tension between them a magnetic pull that even the thick door couldn't sever. She heard him move, the soft, rhythmic click of his silver ring against the interior of the door. He was right there, on the other side, separated by 3 inches of enchanted oak and 1,000 years of pure blood prejudice. Hermione, he breathed, his voice so close it felt like he was whispering directly into her ear. The seal. It needs Malfoy blood to open without an alarm. I can't reach it from the inside. Then give it to me. What? The blood, she said, her voice steadying. Find a way to get it through. A crack, a seam, anything. She watched as a thin, silver-bladed knife slid beneath the door, followed by a dark, viscous smear on a piece of torn silk. The sight of it was a visceral blow, a reminder of the physical cost of their interference with the world's expectations. Hermione didn't hesitate. She took the silk, her fingers stained with the iron-scented reality of him, and pressed it against the Malfoy crest. The silver seal shrieked, a high metallic sound that set her teeth on edge. The atmospheric pressure in the corridor shifted violently, a surge of magic pushing against her chest. But the blood held. The crest glowed a blinding, brilliant white, and then the door swung open with a heavy, agonizing groan. The room was small, lit only by a single flickering torch. Draco was huddled in the corner, his black suit torn, his face a landscape of bruises and pale, cold skin. When he saw her, the mask he had worn for years didn't just slip, it disintegrated. He looked at her with a look of such profound, agonizing relief that it made her chest ache. She didn't wait. She crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to her knees in front of him. The contact was a collision of desperate needs. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into her, her face buried in the crook of his shoulder. Draco let out a broken, jagged sound and clung to her, his fingers digging into the wool of her jumper with a strength born of pure terror. The heat of him was an interference, a jarring impact on her senses that washed away the chill of the cellar. "You're here," he whispered, his breath hot against her hair. "You're actually here." "I told you," she sobbed, her hands roaming over his back, confirming he was real, he was whole. "I told you I wouldn't leave." They stayed like that for a moment, 2 figures silhouetted against the guttering torchlight, a visceral alignment in a place built for suffering. The air in the cellar seemed to hum with the intensity of their connection, a slow-burn flame finally catching light in the darkest of places. But the warmth was temporary. Draco suddenly stiffened, his eyes darting toward the open door. "The wards," he hissed, his voice trembling. They didn't trigger a sound, but my mother, she'll feel the seal break. She'll know someone is in here. We have to go, Hermione said, pulling back to look at him. She reached up, her thumb grazing a cut on his lip. The tactile friction made him wince, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing for a fleeting second. There's no exit, Hermione. The apparition wards are absolute within the manor walls. We have to get to the boundary. Then we fight our way out. Draco looked at her, a ghost of his old arrogant smirk flickering on his bruised face. You really are a Gryffindor, aren't you? Brave, brilliant, and completely insane. And you're a Malfoy, she countered, helping him to his feet. His legs were shaky, a tremor of fatigue and pain running through him. Resourceful, cunning, and currently my only way out of here. They moved toward the door, their hands entwined, their fingers locked in a grip that felt like a lifeline. The atmosphere of the manor was changing. The silence was no longer dead. It was predatory. They could hear the distant, rhythmic clicking of heels on the marble floors above, the sound of voices calling out in the dark. As they reached the base of the stairs, the door at the top flew open. Narcissa Malfoy stood there, her face a pale, sharp mask in the shadows. She didn't have her wand out. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on her son's hand locked in Hermione's. "Draco," she said, her voice a low, melodic ripple. "What have you done?" "I'm leaving, Mother," Draco said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. He didn't let go of Hermione's hand. In fact, he tightened his grip until the bite of his silver ring was all she could feel. "I am leaving this house, and I am not coming back." Narcissa's gaze shifted to Hermione. There was no hatred there, only a profound, weary sadness. She looked at the blood on the floor, the broken seal, and then back at her son. "He will kill you," she whispered. "Your father, the Dark Lord. They will not let this go." "Then let them try," Draco said. Narcissa stepped aside, a motion so subtle it was almost invisible. She didn't speak again, but as they brushed past her, Hermione saw her hand tremble, her fingers clutching at the fine silk of her robes. It was a betrayal of a different kind, a mother's silence in the face of her son's rebellion. They ran, through the kitchens, out into the biting night air, their feet pounding against the frozen earth. The manor behind them was alive now, lights flickering in the windows, the sound of shouting echoing across the grounds. "Almost there!" Hermione panted, the boundary line of the wards shimmering in the moonlight like a veil of silver needles. Just as they reached the edge, a jet of red light sliced through the air, narrowly missing Draco's shoulder. Hermione turned, her wand raised, but Draco didn't stop. He threw himself forward, dragging her with him, and as they crossed the line, the world vanished into the crushing vacuum of apparition once more. They tumbled onto the damp grass of a forest clearing, the air smelling of pine and rain. Hermione scrambled to her feet, her heart nearly bursting from her chest. Draco was lying on his back, gasping for air, his eyes fixed on the stars. "We made it," she breathed, her voice cracking with a mixture of laughter and tears. "Draco, we made it." He didn't answer immediately. He sat up, his movements slow and pained, and looked at her. The moon caught the silver in his hair and the raw, unfiltered emotion in his eyes. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. "You came for me," he murmured, the reality of it finally sinking in. "You actually came." The repulsion was gone. The doubt was gone. There was only the visceral truth of what they were to each other. Draco leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, the atmospheric pressure between them soft and warm for the first time. "I'm never letting you go back to that library, Granger," he whispered. "I'm never letting you go back to being their golden girl." "Good," she whispered back, "because I think I've had enough of gold. I think I prefer the shadows." But as they sat there in the quiet of the forest, Hermione felt a sudden, sharp chill. She looked down at her hand, and there, clutched in her palm, was the piece of silk stained with his blood. It was a reminder that while they had escaped the manor, the war and Harry's judgment was still waiting for them in the light of the morning. The slow burn was far from over. It was just beginning to consume everything they had ever known. The forest was a cathedral of ancient, dripping needles and the suffocating scent of wet earth. Here, miles away from the Malfoy influence and the watchful eyes of the headmaster's portraits, the world felt fragile, reduced to the space between their ragged heartbeats. The adrenaline that had fueled their flight from the manor was receding, leaving a hollow, bone-deep ache in its wake. Hermione sat on a moss-covered root, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists to keep from crying out. Draco was leaning against a nearby birch, his silhouette a jagged tear in the moonlight. He was staring at his own hands, the hands that had bled for her, the hands that had finally broken the seal of his inheritance. The silence between them was no longer the pressurized chamber of the library. It was a vast, open wound. It was the silence of two people who had burned their bridges and were now watching the embers fall into the sea. "They won't stop," Draco said suddenly. His voice was a dry rasp, a tactile friction that seemed to scrape against the stillness of the trees. He didn't look at her. "My father. He'll see this as the ultimate contamination. He'll hunt us, Hermione. Not for the Dark Lord, but for his own pride." Hermione stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of cooling wax. She moved toward him, the damp leaves crunching beneath her boots, a sound that felt like thunder in the quiet. "Let him. We aren't alone, Draco. I have friends. You have Potter," Draco interrupted, finally turning to face her. His grey eyes were turbulent, filled with a visceral, churning conflict. "And what do you think he's doing right now? He's probably pacing the common room, convinced I've kidnapped you, convinced that you're under a confundus or a love potion. He doesn't see you as a woman who made a choice. He sees you as a victim he failed to protect." The truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical interference. She could see it so clearly. Harry's jaw set in that stubborn, righteous line, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the Marauder's map. The repulsion she felt toward that image was sharp and cold. "I don't care what Harry thinks anymore," she whispered, though the lie tasted like copper in her mouth. "Yes, you do," Draco countered, stepping into her space. The atmospheric pressure shifted, the magnetic pull of his presence overwhelming the scent of the pine. He reached out, his fingers hovering just centimeters from her throat, tracing the air where her pulse throbbed. "You've spent your whole life being his conscience. You've spent every waking moment being the brightest witch who keeps the heroes from falling off the edge. You're terrified of what happens when you're just you." "And who am I, Draco?" she breathed, her voice a fragile thread. He closed the gap. His hand didn't just hover, it landed. His palm was cold, but the skin-to-skin contact was an electric jarring impact that made her vision swim. He cupped her jaw, his thumb dragging across her lower lip with a slow, deliberate, tactile friction. "You're the girl who broke into the most dangerous house in England for a boy you're supposed to hate," he murmured, his breath a warm ghost against her skin. "You're a rebel who wears a prefect's badge. You're a storm, Hermione, and I'm the only one who isn't trying to build a dam to hold you back." The vulnerability in his gaze was a visceral alignment. For a second, the internal monologue of fear and duty was silenced. There was only the weight of his hand, the scent of sandalwood and winter, and the desperate, hollowing need to be understood. Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as she rested her forehead against his chest. She could hear his heart, a frantic, uneven rhythm that mirrored her own. But the warmth was punctured by a sudden, sharp crack. Apparition. Not one, but 3 distinct pops echoing through the trees. Draco reacted instantly, shoving Hermione behind him and drawing his wand in one fluid, predatory motion. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the hawthorn wood, his body a shield of black wool and silver hair. Out of the shadows stepped Harry, Ron, and Lupin. The atmosphere in the clearing transformed. The peace was shattered by a visceral surge of hostility. Harry's face was ghost pale, his eyes red-rimmed and burning with a frantic, obsessive energy. When he saw Hermione cowering, or so it appeared to him, behind Draco, he let out a sound that was half sob, half snarl. "Step away from her, Malfoy," Harry commanded, his wand levelled directly at Draco's throat. "I won't tell you again." "Harry, stop!" Hermione cried, trying to move around Draco's shoulder, but Draco held her back with a firm, steady hand. "She came to me, Potter," Draco sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was weary, heavy with the weight of the night's betrayals. "She chose this. Can your tiny, heroic brain not process that?" "She isn't in her right mind," Ron shouted, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "Look at her. She's covered in mud. She's shaking. What did you do to her?" "I saved him," Hermione screamed, her voice echoing through the cathedral of trees. She finally broke free of Draco's grip and stepped into the center of the clearing, her wand held at her side, but her stance defiant. Lucius had him locked in a cellar. He was going to kill him, or worse. "I went there, and I brought him out." The silence that followed was a pressurized chamber of disbelief. Lupin watched her with a sad, clinical detachment. But Harry looked as if she had reached into his chest and physically twisted his heart. "You went to the manor?" Harry whispered, the words barely audible. "Alone? For him?" "Yes." "You risked everything." Harry's voice rose, cracking with the intensity of his internal conflict. "The war, our safety, your life, for a Death Eater's son who wouldn't even look you in the eye for 6 years? He isn't his father, Harry, and I'm not your subordinate." "Hermione, listen to yourself," Lupin said, his voice calm, which was somehow more infuriating than Harry's screaming. "The Malfoy family is deeply entwined with the dark arts. Whatever you think you feel, you must consider the possibility of a charm or a subtle manipulation. Draco is a master of self-preservation." Draco let out a harsh, melodic laugh. "Self-preservation? I just betrayed my entire bloodline. I have nowhere to go, no name to claim, and my father is likely hunting my head as we speak. If this is a manipulation, Lupin, I'm doing a spectacularly poor job of it." Harry didn't listen. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Hermione. "We're taking you back to the castle. We'll get you checked by Madame Pomfrey. We'll fix this." "There is nothing to fix," Hermione countered, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her own wand. "If you try to take me, Harry, I will fight you. I mean it." The tension reached a breaking point. A visceral, static charge filled the air, making the dry leaves dance around their feet. Harry's wand hand was shaking, the whitening of his knuckles a clear indicator of the battle raging within him between his love for his friend and his obsession with his enemy. "Move, Malfoy," Harry hissed, ignoring Hermione and focusing entirely on Draco. "This is between me and her. It stopped being just between you a long time ago, Potter," Draco replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous low frequency. Harry's patience snapped. "Expelliarmus!" The red jet of light was a searing streak, but Draco was faster. He deflected the spell with a jagged flick, the interference causing a shower of sparks to rain down on the damp grass. "Protego! Stop it! Both of you!" Hermione threw herself between them, her arms outstretched. The atmospheric pressure in the clearing was suffocating. "Harry, if you cast another spell, I am leaving. Not with you, not with Draco. I will vanish, and you will never find me." The threat hung in the air like a guillotine. Harry froze, his chest heaving. He looked at Hermione, really looked at her, and saw the raw, unfiltered autonomy in her eyes. He saw the way she didn't look at him for approval, but for space. "You'd choose him?" Harry asked, the heartbreak in his voice more visceral than any curse. "Over us, over everything we've been through." "I'm choosing myself, Harry," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "And right now, myself is standing next to him." Ron looked like he was going to be sick. Lupin simply lowered his wand, a look of profound regret on his scarred face. Harry, however, didn't lower his. He stayed in his dueling stance for a long, agonizing minute, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. Then, with a sudden, jarring motion, he tucked his wand into his back pocket and turned away. "Fine," Harry said, his voice cold and dead. "Stay with him, but don't expect us to come when the manor finds you. You've made your bed, Hermione. I hope the rot is worth it." "Harry," Ron started, but Harry was already walking away, his silhouette disappearing into the dark moor of the trees. Ron lingered for a second, a look of pathetic confusion on his face, before he followed. Lupin gave Hermione one final searching look, a visceral alignment of pity and warning, before he too vanished into the night. The silence that returned to the clearing was heavy, laden with the scent of ozone and the crushing weight of a severed bridge. Hermione stood frozen, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The repulsion she felt for what had just happened was a tidal wave, but beneath it was a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Draco. His touch was different now, not a challenge, but a support. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer hollow platitudes. He simply stood there, his presence a silent anchor in the wreckage of her life. "They hate me," she whispered, the words finally breaking through her composure. "They don't hate you," Draco murmured, his voice a low rasp near her ear. "They hate that they can't control the person you've become. There's a difference." He turned her around, his fingers brushing the tears from her cheeks. The tactile friction was the only thing keeping her grounded. He looked at her with an intensity that was almost unbearable, a mixture of guilt, longing, and a new, fragile kind of trust. "We have to move," he said, his voice sharpening with a sudden, visceral urgency. "Harry was right about one thing. My father will be tracking the apparition trail. We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" she asked, her mind a whirlwind of static. "I have a place," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his bruised lips. "Not a manor, not a school, just a place. Somewhere the air doesn't feel like it's being siphoned out." He reached for her hand, their fingers locking in a visceral pact. As they prepared to apparate once more, Hermione looked back at the dark forest, at the path Harry had taken. The slow burn of her old life had finally reached the foundation, and as the world blurred into the vacuum of space, she realized she wasn't just running away. She was finally, for the first time in her life, running towards something that was entirely hers. The atmospheric pressure of the world was still heavy, and the war was still waiting in the wings. But as they vanished into the night, the only thing she could feel was the bite of his silver ring against her hand. A cold, sharp promise of a future they would have to build out of the ashes. The location Draco chose was a coastal cottage on the jagged edges of the North Sea, a place where the wind howled with a prehistoric ferocity and the air was thick with the brine of the Atlantic. It was a structure of weathered grey stone and salt-crusted timber, standing defiantly against the encroaching tide. Here, the atmospheric pressure was dictated by the moon and the spray, not by the suffocating expectations of the ministry or the brooding silence of the Gryffindor Tower. As they stepped inside, the interior was bathed in the dim, amber glow of a few enchanted candles that flickered to life at their arrival. The scent of dried seaweed, old cedar, and the sharp bite of a dying hearth greeted them. Hermione slumped against the door, the wood cold and solid against her spine. The internal conflict that had been a raging fire in the forest was now a pile of glowing embers, dangerous, but quiet. Draco didn't move toward the fire. He went straight to a small, heavy window, his eyes scanning the pitch-black horizon. His knuckles were white as he gripped the stone sill, his body a tense wire of hypervigilance. The flickering candlelight played over the bruises on his face, highlighting the visceral damage of his father's hand. "The wards are anchored to the bedrock," Draco said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to match the thrum of the waves outside. "My mother set them up years ago. Even Lucius doesn't know the frequency of the pulse. We're safe. For tonight." Hermione watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of warmth and a lingering, jagged repulsion for the world they had left behind. She walked toward him, her footsteps light on the uneven floorboards. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the small of his back before she finally made contact. The tactile friction of her palm against his damp wool coat made him flinch, a reflexive twitch of a man used to being struck. But then he melted into her touch, his shoulders dropping a fraction. "You're shaking," she whispered, moving around him to look into his face. "I'm not," he lied, though his jaw was trembling. He looked down at her, and the mask of the Malfoy heir was nowhere to be found. He looked like a man who had been stripped of his skin and left to face the gale. I've never been on this side of the line before, Granger. The side where everything is gone. No name, no vaults, no legacy. Just this." "You have me," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "And you have your soul. That's more than you had yesterday." Draco let out a jagged, broken breath. He reached for her, his hands finding her waist with a desperate, crushing intensity. He pulled her flush against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. The heat radiating from him was a jarring impact on her senses, a visceral reminder of the life they had nearly lost. Hermione wrapped her arms around his head, her fingers tangling in the silver-blonde silk of his hair, holding him as if she could anchor him to the earth. "I thought I'd lost you in the library," he murmured against her skin. "When Potter looked at those notes, I thought you'd see the sense in him. I thought you'd realize that I'm just a hollowed-out ghost." "I don't care about sense," Hermione replied, her eyes stinging. "I care about the way you look at me when you think no one is watching. I care about the fact that you risked your life to tackle a man you've feared since you were a child." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. The tension between them was no longer a barrier. It was a magnetic pull, a slow-burn desire that had been forged in the crucible of their mutual isolation. She reached up and traced the cut on his cheek, her thumb grazing the sensitive skin. The visceral alignment of their needs was undeniable. "Draco," she breathed. He didn't wait for her to finish. He captured her lips in a kiss that was a collision of salt and fire. It wasn't the tentative, desperate press of the cellar. It was a claim. It was an interference of two lives that had finally merged into a single, chaotic current. Hermione gasped into his mouth, her hands sliding up to his chest, feeling the frantic, rhythmic thudding of his heart beneath his ribs. They moved toward the small sofa near the hearth, their bodies locked in a tactile friction that made the rest of the world. Harry's anger, the war, the threat of the Death Eaters, fade into insignificance. The atmosphere in the cottage was thick with the scent of ozone and the heat of their proximity. As they sat, Draco pulled her onto his lap, his fingers roaming over her face as if he were trying to memorize her features by touch alone. He looked at her with a look of such profound, agonizing vulnerability that it made Hermione's breath hitch. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "I don't know how to be the person you deserve." "You don't have to be a hero, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a sensual, imaginative whisper. "You just have to be real. You just have to stay." "I'm staying," he promised, his voice a low rasp. "Until the sea swallows this rock, I'm staying." The warmth of the moment was deep and restorative, a slow-burn trust that was finally beginning to take root. But even here, in the sanctuary of the storm, the internal monologue of doubt didn't completely vanish. Hermione looked at the window, at the blackness of the night, and felt a sudden, sharp chill. She knew that the morning would bring questions. She knew that the Order would be looking for her, that the Ministry would want an explanation for her disappearance. She felt the repulsion for the social structures she had once defended, the rigid morality that saw the world in black and white, Gryffindor and Slytherin. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the fabric of her sleeve until Draco took her hands in his. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "They won't find us, Hermione. And even if they do, they won't take you back to that version of yourself. I won't let them." "I know," she said, and for the first time, she believed it. They spent the night in a state of suspended animation, huddled together under a heavy wool blanket as the storm raged outside. The rhythmic sound of the waves became a lullaby, a visceral alignment of the natural world with their own internal chaos. Every time Hermione started to drift off, the bite of his silver ring against her hand would ground her, a cold, sharp reminder that she wasn't alone. But as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the salt-stained window, the atmosphere shifted. The storm had subsided, leaving a heavy, pressurized silence in its wake. Draco was asleep, his head resting on her shoulder, his face finally peaceful in the dim light. Hermione watched him, her mind a whirlwind of static and resolve. She knew the final shift was coming. She knew that they couldn't stay in this cottage forever. The war was still out there, and the confrontation with Harry was a wound that hadn't yet begun to scar. The repulsion she felt for her old life was still there, but it was being replaced by a fierce, protective love for the broken boy in her arms. She reached out and touched his hair, the silver strands cool against her skin. She thought of the library, of the notes on the margins, of the way the air had felt when it was being siphoned out. That girl was gone. The golden girl had been burned away in the fire of the Malfoy Manor cellar, leaving behind something much more dangerous and much more real. A sudden, sharp sound, a crack of a branch outside, made her freeze. Her knuckles whitened as she reached for her wand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't wake Draco. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the door, her entire body a taut wire of anticipation. The atmospheric pressure in the room spiked, a surge of static electricity that made her hair stand on end. Was it Harry? Was it Lucius? Or was it just the house settling into the bedrock? The silence stretched, long and agonizing, until the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long, golden streak across the floorboards. The threat, if it had been there, had vanished with the shadows. Hermione exhaled a long, shaky breath and leaned back, her eyes closing. She felt Draco stir beside her, his hand tightening around hers. "Still here?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Still here," she replied. As they watched the sun rise over the North Sea, Hermione knew that the slow burn of their journey was nearing its end. The approach had been painful, the repulsion had been visceral, and the doubt had been a constant companion. But as the warmth of the new day filled the room, she realized that the outcome was no longer in question. They had survived the cellar, they had survived the forest, and they would survive whatever came next. The story was no longer about a Gryffindor and a Slytherin. It was about two people who had found a way to breathe in a world that was trying to suffocate them. And as Draco leaned in to kiss her, a slow, deep contact that tasted of salt and hope, Hermione knew that the resolution they had fought so hard for was finally within their reach. The final shift had occurred. The shadows had become their sanctuary, and the gold of the morning was no longer a cage, but a promise. The final morning broke over the North Sea, not with a roar, but with a shimmering, surgical clarity. The salt-crusted windows of the cottage transformed the rising sun into a fractured mosaic of gold and amber, spilling across the stone floor like liquid light. The atmospheric pressure had settled into a profound, expectant stillness. The storm was gone. The hunt had paused, and for the first time since the library, The air felt thick enough to sustain a life built on choice rather than survival. Hermione watched the light dance over Draco's features. He was still asleep, but his brow was no longer furrowed with the phantom weight of his father's expectations. In the raw, unfiltered glow of the dawn, the bruises on his skin were fading into yellow-green shadows, a visceral map of a war he had finally stopped fighting on behalf of others. She felt a surge of warmth so intense it was a jarring impact on her chest, a realization that the internal conflict which had nearly torn her apart had finally resolved into a singular, unwavering truth. She moved quietly, her bare feet silent on the weathered timber, to the small kitchen. She began to prepare tea, the mundane rhythmic sounds, the splash of water, the clink of a ceramic pot, feeling like a sacred rite of reclamation. She was no longer a soldier in a trio, nor was she a prize to be protected. She was a woman who had walked into the dark and found her own light. A soft floorboard creaked behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The sudden change in the room's temperature, the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood, and the bite of winter air that always followed him, told her he was awake. Draco stepped into her space, his presence an interference that she now welcomed with every fibre of her being. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his long fingers grazing her waist before his arms slid around her, pulling her back against his chest. The tactile friction of his linen shirt against her skin was a grounding force. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath a warm, rhythmic ghost against her neck. "You're thinking again, Granger," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that vibrated through her spine. I can hear the gears turning from across the room. "I'm thinking that I should be more afraid than I am," she whispered, leaning her head back against his collarbone. "I'm thinking about what happens when we leave this rock." Draco turned her in his arms, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that would have been unimaginable a month ago. He looked at her with an intensity that was a visceral alignment of their souls. The grey of his eyes was clear, devoid of the clouds of doubt that had plagued him in the cellar. "We don't go back, Hermione," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, beautiful frequency. "We don't go back to the library or the manor or the versions of us that lived in Potter's shadow or my father's cage. We find a new way to exist, somewhere they can't reach." "Harry will never understand," she said, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edges of his sleeves. "He doesn't have to," Draco replied. "His understanding isn't a requirement for our existence. You've spent too long seeking permission to be happy. I'm telling you now, the only permission you need is your own." The honesty in his words was a visceral blow to her lingering fears. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man he had become. He was morally grey, scarred by his history and broken by his choices. But he was whole in a way that the perfect heroes of her past could never be. He was hers, and she was his, and the slow burn of their attraction had finally consumed every lie they had ever told themselves. He leaned in, his nose brushing against hers. The tension between them was no longer a wire of static. It was a magnetic pull of pure, unadulterated desire. "I love you, Hermione. Not because you're the brightest witch of your age, not because you saved me, but because you're the only person who saw the rot and decided to plant something new anyway." The confession was a jarring impact on her heart. She felt the tears finally spill over, hot and silent. And I love you, Draco, because you're the only one who didn't try to save me from myself." The kiss that followed was the final shift. It was the resolution of every doubt, every repulsion, and every fear they had faced. It was slow, emotional, and deep, a contact that tasted of salt, tea, and the sweet, lingering promise of a future they would build together. His lips were soft but firm, a tactile friction that sent a surge of heat through her entire body. Hermione wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers finding the silver ring he wore, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the searing warmth of his skin. This wasn't a scene from a fairy tale. There was no cheering crowd, no medal of honor, and no forgiveness from the world they had left behind. But as they stood in the golden light of the coastal cottage, the atmospheric pressure of the world felt right for the first time. The air was no longer being siphoned out. It was full, rich, and entirely theirs to breathe. They spent the morning on the small porch, watching the tide retreat from the grey rocks. The North Sea was a vast, glittering expanse of freedom. The internal monologue of Hermione Granger was finally quiet, replaced by the simple, visceral reality of Draco's hand in hers. "What now?" she asked, her voice light and steady. Draco looked out at the horizon, a ghost of a smile, a real one this time, touching his lips. He squeezed her hand, the bite of his ring a familiar, comforting pressure. "Now," he said, "we go where the map doesn't show us. We go where the names don't matter." He stood up, pulling her with him. They stood on the edge of the world, two figures silhouetted against the gold of the new day. There was no more repulsion. There was no more doubt. There was only the visceral alignment of two hearts that had found a way to beat in the dark. As they stepped off the porch and moved toward the boundary where the magic would carry them away, Hermione didn't look back at the cottage or the path to Hogwarts. She looked only at Draco. The slow burn had reached its peak, and the flame it left behind was steady, enduring, and bright enough to light the way forward. The war would continue, and the world would keep turning. But for Draco and Hermione, the conflict was over. They had found their sanctuary in the shadows, and as they vanished into the morning mist, the only thing left behind was the sound of the waves, a rhythmic, eternal witness to a love that had broken every rule to survive. The air in the French Alps carried a different quality of silence than the damp, pressurized stillness of the Scottish Highlands. Here, at an elevation where the clouds brushed against the timber balconies of their chalet, the atmosphere was thin, crystalline, and sweet with a scent of pine resin and wood smoke. It was a place where the past could not easily climb. 3 years had passed since the night the North Sea had swallowed their old identities. Yet for Hermione, every morning still felt like a visceral reclamation of a life she had once thought lost to the static of war. She stood on the wide, sun-drenched terrace, her fingers wrapped around a mug of dark coffee. The ceramic was warm, a steady, tactile friction against her palms that grounded her in the present. Below her, the valley stretched out in a lush tapestry of emerald and gold, a world away from the grey stone corridors of Hogwarts. She no longer wore the heavy, restrictive wool of a school uniform or the armoured robes of an order member. Instead, she wore a soft, cream-coloured silk wrap that felt like a second skin, a luxury she allowed herself in this new, quiet reality. The internal monologue that had once been a frantic list of duties and should-bes had settled into a rhythmic, peaceful hum. She didn't need to straighten her cuffs anymore. There was no nervous energy left to siphon. The repulsion she had once felt for her own choices had long since dissolved, replaced by a deep, bone-settling certainty. The glass door behind her slid open with a soft, melodic hiss. She didn't turn, but her body reacted with a visceral alignment, her shoulders dropping and her heart finding a steadier tempo. Draco stepped onto the terrace. The sun caught the silver blonde of his hair, which he now wore slightly longer, the strands catching the breeze. He wasn't the hollowed-out ghost she had rescued from the cellar. His face had filled out, the sharp, jagged angles of his youth softening into a rugged, healthy composure. The bruises were gone, replaced by the faint, fine lines of a man who actually spent time laughing. He moved into her space, his presence an interference that brought a sudden, familiar heat to her side. He didn't say a word at first. He simply stood beside her, looking out at the mountains, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark trousers. The silence between them was a sanctuary, a pressurized chamber of mutual understanding that required no translation. "The owl from Paris arrived," Draco said, his voice a low, smooth rasp that still sent a rhythmic tremor down Hermione's spine. "The research grant for the Alchemical Institute was approved. They want you to lead the department for non-verbal theory." Hermione felt a surge of warmth, a jarring impact of pride that had nothing to do with being the brightest witch for the sake of a trio. This was hers. Her mind, her work, uncoupled from the expectations of the wizarding world's heroes. "And your commission?" she asked, turning to him. Draco's mouth quirked into a ghost of his old smirk, but the malice was entirely absent. "The vineyard in Bordeaux wants the soil revitalization charms by next month. It seems they value a Malfoy's knowledge of the earth more than they value the name itself." He reached out, his hand finding hers on the railing. The contact was a collision of history and hope. The bite of his silver ring was still there, a cold, sharp reminder of where they had been, but his palm was searingly warm. He interlaced their fingers, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles with a slow, deliberate, tactile friction that made her breath hitch. "We did it, didn't we?" she whispered, her eyes searching his. "We survived," he corrected, his gaze softening. "And then we started living. There's a difference, Hermione." He pulled her toward him, and she went willingly, her head resting against the solid, rhythmic thudding of his heart. The scent of him, sandalwood, mountain air, and something uniquely Draco, enveloped her like a shield. In this height, far above the reach of the Marauder's map or the Malfoy legacy, the atmospheric pressure was perfect. The internal conflict that had once defined her, the can't stand it versus can't help but think, had matured into a slow-burn devotion. She thought of Harry occasionally, a distant ache of a severed bridge, but the repulsion was gone. She hoped he was happy in his world of black and white morality, just as she was happy in her world of shadows and grey. Draco tilted her chin up, his grey eyes reflecting the brilliant blue of the alpine sky. There was no more guilt in his expression, no more of the rot he had once feared. He was a man who had looked at the shattered pieces of his foundation and chosen to build something beautiful out of the wreckage. "I have something for you," he murmured, his voice dropping to a sensual, imaginative whisper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, there was no family crest, no heavy gold, no ancient weight of expectation. It was a simple band of white gold, set with a single brilliant emerald that caught the light like the leaves of the forest where they had first truly chosen each other. "I don't have a manor to give you," he said, his voice trembling just enough to betray the vulnerability he still felt only around her. "I don't have a seat in the Wizengamot or a legacy of blood, but I have this life, and I have a future that I don't want to see a single day of without you by my side." The visceral alignment of the moment was overwhelming. Hermione felt the tears prick at her eyes, not tears of frustration or fear, but of a profound, shattering relief. "I don't want a manor, Draco," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "I just want the man who tackled his father for me. I just want the boy who wrote in the margins of my books." He slid the ring onto her finger. The fit was perfect, the metal a cool interference against her skin. He didn't wait for her to speak again. He captured her lips in a kiss that was the definitive resolution of their story. It tasted of the morning air, of the coffee on her breath, and of 3 years of hard-won peace. It was a long, slow-burn contact, a tactile friction that radiated through her entire body, grounding her in the reality of their happy ending. As they stood on the terrace, 2 figures silhouetted against the vastness of the Alps, the world felt immense and full of possibility. The war was a shadow in the valley. The cellar was a nightmare that had long since faded. The library was a memory of a beginning. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, they sat by the fire inside the chalet. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the low, rhythmic crackle of the flames. Hermione lay with her head in Draco's lap, a book forgotten in her hand, as he traced patterns on her arm with his fingers. "Are you happy, Hermione?" he asked, his voice a soft vibration in the quiet room. She looked up at him, at the man she had chosen, at the life they had carved out of the ashes of their past. She felt the weight of the ring on her finger, the warmth of the fire, and the steady, unwavering pulse of the man she loved. "I'm more than happy, Draco," she whispered, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. "I'm free." The final shift was complete. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt, no more looking back. The gold of the morning had become the amber of the evening, and as the stars began to pierce the velvet dark above the mountains, Hermione Granger, the woman who had chosen the shadows, finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had walked through the fire with her. The story was over, but their life was just beginning, written not in the margins of a library book, but in the boundless open air of a world they had made their own. In the silence of the Alps, the air was full, and for the first time in forever, it was easy to breathe.
Writing this story was a journey for me. It is not just about magic, it is about choices. Sometimes the people we love try to control us. They think they know what is the best. But true love is different. True love sees who you really are. Hermione and Draco were from 2 different worlds. They had many reasons to hate each other, but they found a bridge in the dark. They learned that freedom is more important than being a hero or a legacy. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. It is okay to be yourself. It is okay to walk away from the light to find your own truth. Thank you for listening to my words. Thank you for feeling this story with me. Love is the strongest magic of all. Until next time, be brave, be real, goodbye.